What would you do if one day you woke up and found out you were being fined $300,000 just for living on land your grandfather left you? I'm an unemployed software engineer. They're an overreaching HOA corporation armed with fake maps, made up, regulations, and a brazen land grab scheme. What they didn't expect was, I didn't just bring a laptop and some old maps. I brought the legacy of a farmer who never bowed down. And this is the story of how I turned a legal threat into a community agriculture hub and brought down an entire HOA empire with the one thing they underestimated most: the truth. 6 months ago, I was a 35-year-old software engineer living in the heart of Seattle, a city of rain and code. I had a job at a trendy AI startup with standing desks, free cold brew, and a Friday ritual of pretending to laugh at the boss's jokes. My life was following the predictable upward path: code, promotion, early retirement, move to Bali to grow mangoes. Until the tech market imploded like a misfired script, the company folded, the team dissolved. The final email from the CEO was just 3 lines. Sorry, we're out of funds. No severance. Good luck. Just like that, I, Alex Carson, plummeted from the tech middle class into economic freefall in under 72 hours. While I was still stuck in the autopilot haze of job apps and draining savings, I got a call that snapped me out of it. Hello, this is the private attorney of Mr. James Carson. We need to speak to you about inheritance matters. My grandfather, James Carson, the man who taught me how to ride horses, fix fences, and fish for salmon as a kid, had passed away at 89. I thought I'd get to see him one more time. I was wrong. I left Seattle in my beat-up SUV, heading east past snow-capped mountains and endless pine forests. It felt like I was fleeing my old life. As I crossed the state line, the urban skyline faded in my rear view, and childhood memories crept in with every fence post, rusted windmill, and stretch of open field. My grandfather's ranch, Creekside, Haven, he called it, was about 20 minutes from the tiny town of Elkford. It used to be my summer sanctuary, a place with no Wi-Fi but plenty of stories about cows, wind, and patience. The old 2-story wooden house was still standing, like a proud old soldier refusing to fall. But when I pulled up, I didn't just see memories, I saw houses, lots of houses. 2-story suburban homes with pristine lawns trimmed like mini golf courses, shiny SUVs parked in uniform rows, the kind of copy-paste suburban development you find in a spreadsheet-shaped world. And the weirdest part? Some of them looked like they were sitting right on my grandfather's land. I stepped into the house, everything untouched, like he'd just stepped out for a moment. The armchair by the window, a coffee mug unwashed in the sink, and on the wooden table, a crisp white envelope that read in bold, Sunridge Hills Homeowners Association. Notice of severe violation. Before I could even take off my shoes, there was a knock at the door. An older woman, suntanned in a denim shirt and wide-brimmed hat, stood there. You must be Alex, James's grandson? I nodded. She gave a faint smile. I'm Bonnie. Been living here nearly 40 years. Your grandfather was the last one around here brave enough to stand up to the clipboard vultures. Clipboard what? I asked, confused. She didn't answer, just pointed to the letter in my hand and said, You'll want to read that before you start unloading. The letter opened with a silky threat. We hereby notify you that the property located at 1172 Creekside Trail is in default of $300,000 in HOA fines due to repeated violations over the past 5 years. The list of violations read like a poorly written legal drama: $100 a month for not planting the HOA-approved type of grass 75 month, for agricultural activity inconsistent with residential zoning, $750 in admin fees for not replying to HOA emails. Yes, they fined my grandpa for ignoring email. And the kicker, they threatened to foreclose the property, meaning they'd auction off the ranch unless I paid within 30 days. I stared at Bonnie, stunned. But my grandfather wasn't part of any HOA. This is private land. Been in the family for generations." She nodded, her face tightening with anger. "They built Sunridge Hills 6 years ago, then slowly expanded. First it was just a few shared security cameras. Then came the boundary rezoning proposals. Your grandfather was the only one who refused to sign the easement. They hated that. That night I wandered the property holding the old land maps my grandfather had kept in his desk. By moonlight, I could still see the worn wooden stakes, markers from a time when men used horses instead of pickup trucks. And those markers were right in the middle of Sunridge Hills. I looked up, across the weathered fence, at the golden glow of suburban porch lights, the scent of firewood, the sound of laughter through double-glazed windows, all of it mocking me. They had built homes on my grandfather's land, and now they had the nerve to fine me for violating HOA boundaries. I sighed and stepped back inside. What those clipboard vultures didn't know, I used to be a software engineer in Seattle, and I know how to debug a broken system, especially one dressed up as a community but rotten at its core. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because of the unfamiliar silence of the ranch or the strange chill of a late Montana spring, but because of the stack of documents sitting on the kitchen table. That cursed white envelope, $300,000 in fines, $750 in administrative fees, plus a threat to place a lien on the land, and all of it based on HOA violations over the past 5 years I'd never heard of, let alone imagined happening on a modest old ranch that wasn't part of any neighborhood. I turned on the kitchen light, poured myself the last of the cold coffee, and sat back down at the table, where Barb Thompson, the neighbor lady, had left her pen after our talk earlier, that afternoon. "Look for a folder labeled Boundaries in James's old office," she'd said. "He suspected the HOA did something to the property lines, and if I'm right, you'll find some pretty interesting stuff there." So I did. My grandfather's office was just as he'd left it. Papers neatly stacked, black and white photos plastering the corners of the wall, and his old typewriter sitting silently beneath a light layer of dust. On the wooden shelf behind his desk sat dozens of folders, notebooks, and creased old maps. It took me almost an hour to find what I was looking for, a faded file folder with yellowing paper labeled in shaky blue ink. Boundaries, 1952-2019, I opened it, nearly dropping the oldest map inside, a hand-drawn survey from 1952 marking every boundary post on the Carson Ranch. I paused, running my finger along the faint inked lines. The eastern edge stretched all the way to the small creek, now replaced by a row of newly built homes in the Suncrest Valley HOA development. No mistake about it. The stone markers my grandfather had placed, according to the photo notes, were now sitting squarely inside that residential subdivision. Next to it was the 2019 map submitted by the HOA when applying to build Phase 2 of their neighborhood. And that's when it hit me. The boundary had been pushed back nearly 300 yards, not through any official legal procedure, not through a purchase agreement, but simply by redrawing the map. They'd built an entire row of houses on my family's land, and were now fining me for not mowing my lawn to HOA standards. I remembered what my grandfather once told me when I was 14, after I'd accidentally stepped on a row of newly planted trees. Once a line is marked, don't move it, because land markers are like promises. If someone erases them, there's nothing left to hold the boundary, and I swore I wasn't going to let anyone erase his line. The next morning, I brought the folder to the county land records office. Barb sat beside me in the truck, clutching her coffee while I shook with quiet fury. "Jenny in records is a good person," she said. "She's known James since high school. If you need evidence, she'll point you to the exact spot to dig." Jenny, a woman in her 50s with her hair in a bun and glasses hanging from a chain, took one look at the 1952 map and nodded immediately. "James came here a few times," she said. Every time he'd say the same thing. They're encroaching on my land. But he passed before he could finish filing the case. She showed me the official county maps, specifically the 2019 submission, from the HOA. Then pointed to a tiny marker in the corner. This is marker number 7. On the 1952 map, it's right here. But the new map moves it nearly 300 yards west. If you look closely, the encroached land includes the entire new housing row and half the Suncrest Valley HOA clubhouse. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. They'd actually built the HOA clubhouse, their temple of authority, on land that didn't even belong to them. Can I commission an independent survey to confirm this? I asked. Absolutely, Jenny said. Call Bill Matthews, most reputable guy we've got. Doesn't deal with the HOA. Helped James out back in the day. I called Bill. The next day, he showed up with a GPS rig, survey charts, and the gruff attitude of a man who didn't waste words. All morning, we hiked the perimeter. He restaked old wooden posts, measured GPS coordinates, and scribbled notes across his paper maps. Max, my grandfather's old sheepdog, trailed behind us like he was guarding the land for his former master. That afternoon, Bill stood by his pickup, flipping open a map and tapping the corner with his finger. 10 acres encroached, he said. 15 homes, half the clubhouse, all sitting on Carson land. I took a deep breath. This wasn't suspicious anymore. This was a battlefield. Bill looked at me, nodded slowly. I'll send you the certified survey tomorrow morning. And if you need a lawyer, call Ben Hawkins in Billings, my brother-in-law. Tough as nails. Real estate's his thing. I shook his hand and thanked him. But inside, I was burning. I'd just found my first bullet. That night, I sat alone in my grandfather's old office, maps spread across the desk, the lamp casting shadows over hand-drawn lines on yellowed paper. I looked out the window, toward the glowing homes in the distance. Homes built on land that wasn't theirs. Tomorrow I'd go to the HOA office. But this time, I wasn't going to listen. I was going to declare war. When I opened the pale yellow file folder labeled Boundary in my grandfather's scrawled handwriting, I had no idea it contained a treasure. Not gold or money, but a collection of old maps, a photo archive of faded stone markers, and page after page of handwritten notes he had recorded during the last years of his life. On each photo was a small stone marker, some overgrown with weeds, others nestled behind the manicured lawns of model homes in a development the HOA called Sun Valley Estates. I pulled out my phone and started comparing every photo to the digital county map I'd just downloaded from the public records database. And just like Barb had said, the land that the HOA claimed was behind the community clubhouse was, actually, deep inside Carson land. The next morning, I reached out to Bill Matthews, the surveyor Jenny at the county records office had recommended. He arrived right on time, driving an old pickup, wearing faded jeans and mud-stained boots. He didn't say much, just nodded at me, popped the truck bed, and started unloading a GPS unit and a backpack full of maps like he'd done this 100 times. We walked for hours along the old fence line, circled the small creek on the western edge, and crossed the open field behind the Sun Valley golf course. Bill used a laser distance measurer, checking actual GPS coordinates against my grandfather's 1952 survey. By late morning, he stopped quietly in front of a small, weathered stone marker, cracked but still standing. "There it is," he said, voice low and solid as bedrock. I followed his gaze, heart pounding. If this was indeed the original survey marker as recorded in the old map, then nearly 10 acres of land, including part of the HOA's clubhouse, was sitting on Carson property, unauthorized. Bill pointed to the map. "Your grandfather wasn't wrong. This marker matches exactly with the 1952 record. Based on that, 15 of the current homes and half the community clubhouse sit on your family's land." I let out a long breath. Excited, but also overwhelmed by a strange feeling. Justice confirmed. And yet I knew. The real game had only just begun. Bill said he'd have the full notarized survey report finished by the next day. Before he left, he looked over and added, "You're going to need a damn good lawyer. Call Ben Hawkins in Billings. He's my brother-in-law. Been handling land disputes for 30 years. Doesn't scare easy, not even when the other side's got money." That afternoon, I grabbed a copy of the original map, my grandfather's notes, and the photos of the marker and drove straight to the HOA office. It was a 2-story building clad in faux rustic stonework, trying hard to look like a mountain lodge, but everything about it reeked of freshly printed money and artificial authority. The receptionist looked at me with a mix of disdain and pity. When I asked to speak to Victoria Reynolds, the HOA president, she hesitated for a moment, then quietly picked up the phone and whispered something. 5 minutes later, I was led into the main conference room. Inside sat a sharply dressed woman, in a tailored gray suit, her bob haircut crisp, her eyes cold as frost. This was Victoria. She didn't rise, just offered a thin smile. "Mr. Carson, so we finally meet. My condolences about your grandfather. He was rather stubborn." I placed the preliminary report from Bill on the table, along with the 1952 map. "I think you've been building your community on land that doesn't belong to you, Ms. Reynolds." Her eyes flicked over the documents, lips tightening as if she'd just bitten into a lemon. After a few moments of silence, she said, something that made me laugh out loud. "You've been here less than a week and already you're an expert in land use law? These old documents won't change anything." I sat up straighter, locking eyes with her. "Maybe you're right, but an old map, combined with a new survey report, might be enough to create a court case the media would love." Victoria stood up. That was the end of our conversation. No handshake. I walked out of the HOA office with more clarity than I'd felt in years. I was no longer a laid-off software engineer drifting around looking for meaning. I was Alex Carson, heir to James Carson. And I wasn't going to let anyone steal this land with a handful of dirty paperwork. That night, I called Ben Hawkins. I walked into the HOA meeting like I was stepping onto a battlefield. The Suncrest clubhouse looked more like a high-end resort complex. Wooden walls, warm yellow lighting, herbal tea station, and a reception area lined with drone-shot photos from above. I had worked in places that aestheticized control like this before, and now I was in the thick of it. And just as expected, Victoria Reynolds, the HOA president and self-proclaimed queen of the entire neighborhood, was standing at the front of the room like she was about to launch a new line of furniture, not preside over a community meeting. I took a seat in the back, near the wall. The room was packed with residents, some in polos, others in casual dresses, everyone looking like they'd just stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. But behind their smiles was skepticism. Rumors about me had already spread, and I wasn't surprised when a few wary eyes glanced in my direction. Victoria kicked off the meeting in a tone that felt more like a talk show host than a board chair. "We'll begin with the quarterly financial report, followed by the new landscaping plan around the pool." I sat still, waiting for the part I knew was coming. When the resident comments section opened, I stood up. "My name is Alex Carson. I'm the grandson of James Carson, who owned this land before the Suncrest development was built." A ripple of murmuring spread across the room. Victoria raised an eyebrow, but her smile remained perfectly frozen, like it had been pre-printed on her face. "I'm here because I've discovered that a significant portion of the Suncrest neighborhood, including the building we're sitting in, was constructed on land that legally belongs to my family." The atmosphere in the room changed. Tension tightened like a violin string. A few people sat up straighter. A woman in the third row leaned over to whisper something to her husband. "I'm sorry?" Victoria interjected, her voice laced with theatrical concern. "Mr. Carson, I'm afraid you're mistaken. All of the structures here were built legally based on approved zoning maps. I raised the independent survey report from Bill Matthews. I have documentation proving the property boundaries were unlawfully redrawn. This is an independent survey from a professional with no ties to the development." Someone stood up, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with the look of a born litigator. "I'd like to see that report," she said. "I'm Dana Mitchell. I practice environmental law. If there's a case of land encroachment, we need clarity. Victoria." Began to say something, but Dana turned to me and raised her voice just enough for the room to hear. "Could you send me a copy? I'll review every detail." I nodded. I brought multiple copies. I also have the original 1952 zoning map, certified by the county. The murmurs in the room had shifted from concern to outrage. An older man in the front row said loudly, "Wait! If this is true, are we living on stolen land?" Victoria jumped in. "This is not the appropriate forum for legal discussions. Anyone with a complaint can file with the board. And what? If the board is the one responsible?" Another voice rang out. I turned to see. It was Barb, my neighbor, slipping in from the back like a surprise cameo in a movie that just changed its entire plot. I smiled and said, "I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here to assert my legal rights and to request that the illegitimate fines imposed on my grandfather's property by the HOA be nullified. And if anyone here is affected by boundary discrepancies, I highly suggest you review your purchase agreements." Victoria stood motionless. The icy control in her eyes had begun to thaw. Her polished words held no power against the weight of evidence now on the table. The meeting ended unofficially. No one was talking about paint colors or pool lights anymore. Residents crowded around me, some confused, some angry, but none indifferent. That night, Dana texted me. "I want to help. Coffee at 9 a.m. tomorrow? We've got work to do." I looked out over the field where my grandfather once stood and felt, just for a moment, as if he were placing a hand on my shoulder. This battle was just beginning, but I wasn't alone anymore. I had the original maps, the independent land survey, and now a stack of evidence painting a picture Victoria could no longer deny. They had built homes on my grandfather's land, then turned around and fined my family for HOA violations. But the truth ran deeper. This wasn't just about one piece of land anymore. It was about power, manipulation, and a community being led by greed, disguised as development. When I returned to the little wooden house on the hill, the home, my grandfather once called his final stronghold against the wave of concrete, I started planning my counterattack. But instead of using bricks and stones, I used documents, evidence, and strategy. I reached out to Dana Mitchell, the environmental attorney I'd met at the last HOA meeting. She was sharp, direct, and had disliked Victoria since the first day she bought a house in Sun Valley. When I showed her the maps and the survey documents, Dana's eyes lit up with a kind of focused anger I'd never seen in a lawyer before. "You've got a major case here," she said, flipping through copies from the archive. "This isn't just land encroachment. It's property fraud, and possibly even abuse of the legal system through coercion." I nodded. I already knew it. But hearing it from Dana confirmed what I'd suspected from the beginning. Victoria hadn't just built in the wrong place. She'd built on a foundation of lies and then used the legal system itself to punish those who resisted. Dana proposed a different approach. Instead of going straight after the HOA, she said, we take the long route, prove first that they never had legal jurisdiction over that land. Once we establish that, every fine and enforcement action collapses. It sounded simple, but to make it work, we needed two things: proof that they knowingly did wrong, and an inside witness. And, right on cue, Carlos came forward, a civil engineer who had worked for a subcontractor during the Sun Valley expansion project. Barb had introduced me to him at a small community meeting where residents were finally starting to share their own stories of being bullied by Victoria. Carlos had witnessed how the survey teams were constantly switched out. Once, even a team. Member was fired for mentioning an incorrect stake location. Carlos didn't want to go public. He still had to work in the region, but he agreed to share a key document, an internal email exchange between project managers, clearly stating the section between markers A3 and B6 may overlap with Carson. Lot, handle quietly. No adjustments unless there's a formal complaint. Dana and I both held our breath after reading it. This, she said, is a gold mine. We don't need to sue. We just need to go public at the right time, in the right place, and they'll fold on their own. Dana suggested I host an outdoor gathering right on the disputed land, not to argue with Victoria, but to present the facts to the press, to the residents, to the truth. I had thought that exposing Victoria Reynolds, the self-appointed queen of the Sun Valley HOA, with legal evidence and historic maps, would be the final blow. But I had forgotten one thing. People like her don't fall because of the truth. They only retreat when every path to power is sealed shut. And to close those doors, I needed more than documents. I needed public opinion. Dana, the neighborhood attorney and now my closest ally, was the one who laid out the next step. Justice in a courtroom is one thing, she said, but justice in the hearts of the people, that's what truly scares those in power. We decided to organize a public presentation, a gathering held directly on the disputed land, where Victoria had illegally built a clubhouse and several luxury homes. I set up a makeshift wooden podium, rented a small speaker system, and printed enlarged copies of all the evidence: the 1952 map, Bill's current land survey, water rights documents, and, most importantly, a recording of Victoria admitting everything. That day, the Montana sky was a deep, clear blue over the rolling hills, peaceful, as if it knew today was a historic day for this land. I arrived early to set everything up. Barb brought folding chairs, cookies, and coffee. She didn't say much, just rested her hand on my shoulder and nodded. James would be proud. About 100 residents from Sun Valley and nearby areas showed up, some with skeptical looks, others anxious, but most were curious, wondering if they really were living on land that didn't belong to them. I began speaking slowly but firmly, recounting the story, from the $300,000 fine notice I received to discovering the old maps, to Barb's guidance, Bill's survey, and finally the audio recording of Victoria threatening me in her office. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply presented facts, documents, and the truth. When I played the recording, the crowd fell completely silent. Victoria's voice echoed loud and clear. I know that land used to belong to your family, but now it's part of the future, and there's no place in the future for people clinging to the past. Then came the veiled threat. I have ways to make this disappear without involving the courts. Dana stepped forward and spoke. We're not here to reclaim land with blood and tears. We're here to offer a solution. 3 conditions. I raised 3 fingers. The HOA must cancel all fines and acknowledge that the Carson land lies outside their jurisdiction. Victoria Reynolds must resign from the HOA board and sell her shares in the remaining undeveloped land. A land lease agreement must be established between me and the HOA, allowing Sun Valley residents to stay in their homes without legal threats. A wave of murmurs spread across the crowd. A man in a polo shirt stood up. I retired here. I don't want to lose my house because she lied to us. An elderly woman nodded. We came here for peace, not to be exploited. Victoria stood at the back of the crowd, fists clenched, lips tight as if on the edge of an outburst. But this time, no one backed her. No one stepped forward to interrupt. She no longer controlled the room. The room now belonged to justice. By the end of the gathering, the residents voted, not officially but overwhelmingly, in support of my proposal. Dana would draft the agreements. Gerald, the now former HOA attorney, awkwardly approached and offered to help with the paperwork. I smiled. Dana's got it, but thanks. Victoria said nothing. She walked up to me, eyes steely cold. You don't understand how big this is, she whispered. I built a community. I won't let you ruin it. I looked her in the eye. I'm not ruining anything. You built it on land that was never yours. As the crowd began to disperse, an older man approached me. I've lived here since the beginning, he said. I never thought I'd support someone going against the HOA. But this time, I'm with you. I nodded, still clutching my grandfather's weathered old map. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't just reclaiming land. I was reclaiming justice. That was the last time I saw Victoria at Sun Valley in a position of power. A week later, the official HOA meeting took place. The results: Victoria was removed from her position. Dana was elected to replace her. All fines were dropped. The land lease agreement was signed. A new chapter had begun. But the best part? I stood there, not as an unemployed software engineer anymore, but as a man who understood the value of the land his grandfather left behind. A man who didn't just protect the past, but helped shape a better future for an entire community. And that war with the HOA, Karen, it ended with a perfect victory. I left the courthouse that day feeling like I had just won a crucial round. Judge Simmons had done what no one else had dared to do, forced Victoria to wait and face the truth. No foreclosure, no bogus fines. At least for now, my grandfather's. Land and I were free to breathe. But Victoria Reynolds wasn't one to give up so easily. 3 days later, I received a message from her assistant requesting a private meeting at the Sun Valley office. Again. A final offer, they said. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I knew this. If I wanted to end this battle for good, I had to look into the eyes of the woman who had trampled on my family's legacy and give her a final answer. Victoria's office was just as cold and ostentatious as the first time I walked in, but this time, no formalities, no tea, no water. Just Victoria, standing by the tall window, espresso cup in hand, staring out at the rows of homes she had built, half of them on my land. Mr. Carson, she said without turning around, we're both tired, aren't we? I didn't respond. I waited for her to continue. This, she turned, placing a folder on the desk, is the final offer, $2 million. You transfer all the land, drop the lawsuit, and we put this whole mess to rest. You return to Seattle. I will continue the project. Everyone wins. I opened the folder. The money was real. More than I ever imagined getting when I first considered selling the land. $2 million could buy me a fresh life. No HOA, no drama, no Victoria. But I didn't need a clean life. I needed justice. Have proof you intentionally altered the boundary lines, I said calmly. You knew the groundwater rights contract your company acquired from Western Waters was still active. And you never paid my grandfather a cent of what he was owed. Her gaze darkened. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in Victoria's voice, something unsteady. You really think you can beat me with some old contract and a few wrinkled maps? I pulled out my phone from my jacket pocket. And a recording of you threatening me, admitting you knew about the real boundary lines. Yes, and under Montana law, that recording is perfectly legal. Nothing else needed to be said. She understood. The silence stretched, thick as if the entire room was holding its breath. At last, Victoria drew back her hand, as though realizing she had just been checkmated in the final round. I will not kneel, she growled. I don't need you to, I said, turning toward the door. I just need you off my family's land. When I walked out of the Sun Valley office, no one saw me out. No goodbyes. Just me, alone, standing on land that had once been seized and was now on the verge of being returned to its rightful owner. What I felt wasn't triumph. It was peace. That evening, I told Dana, Barb, and Sheriff Dawson everything. We sat on The front porch, watching the sunset dye the prairie red, knowing the final showdown was near, and I was ready. I never thought a day would come when I'd be standing in my grandfather's field, watching children run around experimental vegetable beds, and feel truly at peace. After that fateful HOA meeting, everything changed faster than I could catch. My breath. Victoria Reynolds wasn't just removed from the board, she was forced to withdraw all her holdings from the Sun Valley project. A week later, I received the official documents. All fines, including the absurd $300,000, and legal. Demands were nullified. At the same time, a new lease agreement was signed, allowing me to retain full ownership of my grandfather's land, while earning steady income from the parts where Sun Valley residents were still temporarily living. A victory, but not the kind you jump up and down celebrating. It was the quiet kind, pensive almost, melancholic, because I knew there were things my grandfather never got to witness. There are still nights I ask myself, if I had come back sooner, would he have felt less alone in his final days? But I also know he would be proud, and because of that, I chose not to leave. I didn't sell the land. I didn't go back to Seattle. I stayed. With support from Dana, who had by now become a close friend and co-founder, I transformed the Carson Farm into a community agricultural education center. The idea came from a single line in my grandfather's journal. I wish kids from the city knew what it felt like to plant a seed and watch it grow. We started small. An old shed turned into a classroom, a few rows of clean crops, some instructional, signs, and a website. Then local school kids began to visit. Parents started volunteering. Even some Sun Valley residents, who once eyed me with suspicion, became active contributors. Barb, the first person who warned me about Victoria, still shows up every Wednesday evening, bringing cornbread and a long list of advice nobody dares. Question. James would cry if he saw that greenhouse you built, she chuckles. Not 'cause it's beautiful, 'cause it's cleaner than any kitchen he ever had. Dana didn't just remain my legal partner. She helped me establish a fund to support other landowners facing HOA harassment. From one little land dispute, we sparked a movement, a community of people who no longer stood quietly in the face of unjust authority or shady power games like Victoria's. And Victoria? The last I heard, she had quietly left the area and was selling off her assets. The media was beginning to revisit her old development projects, now followed by a string of lawsuits from other landowners preparing to take action. Her empire was crumbling, and this time there was no one left to take the fall for her. One morning, while I was cleaning out the chicken coop, I received a handwritten letter. It was from a Sun Valley resident, one who had fiercely opposed me at that first meeting. In the letter, he wrote, "I used to think you were a threat to my family's dream. Turns out you were the only one brave enough to protect it." I smiled, folded the letter, and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Max, my loyal dog ever since I moved back, gave a soft bark as he spotted the kids arriving for a farm tour. I waved at them and walked over to the new wooden sign near the entrance. On it, I carved a quote from my grandfather, words that have become not only a tribute, but the legacy I want to pass on to the next generation. Never underestimate a farmer, especially one with an old map.